in the chat, but if you don't want to click on it and you don't want to open it, that's also fine. I will be sharing my screen with the text that I'll be talking about when I get up to those sections. But I thought in case people wanted to have the paper in front of them and they had the ability to print it, it might be nice or to have on a parallel window.
You can't get to it though, because when I just tried to link to it, I had to have a Northwestern ID to log in.
Yeah, the password.
Or you have
Ditto.
to.
I tried it too.
Yeah, me
And I
too.
couldn't get in.
You have to have password.
Right. And you can
That
only
is
get one by
upsetting.
paying. You don't get it, can't get a free login.
Huh.
Just do the sharing of the screen. If you're okay with that, we can do it that way. Too.
Okay, I'll just do the sharing of the screen. I apologize that that didn't work. Okay.
No problem.
Live and learn. We try new things. Yeah, so how do you know if and when through ongoing interpretation you are eroding the foundation of Judaism, and what is considered that foundation? This is a fantastic question. And it's one that I don't know if I'm going to give a satisfactory answer to. I don't know that there is really a bedrock foundation of Judaism, because every time I dig deeper and deeper, I find interpretation and reinterpretation. And I mean, going back to, you go back to the Torah itself, to the Bible, and you find that the major argument is an argument for monotheism, right? So we can all agree that the message of the Bible is monotheism. And yet, if you take a historian's set of tools to the Bible, you can actually see that certain sections of the Bible aren't really fully monotheistic. They don't believe in a single God exclusively. They believe in the service of God with the acknowledgement of multiple gods, something called monolatry, right? So what is the bedrock of Judaism? Is the bedrock of Judaism monotheism? I'm comfortable saying that, but on some level, it's not fair to groups of people who lived what they probably thought were Jewish lives, but were monolatrous. So it's a very tough question, and I think it gets to the question of canon and canonicity that I talked a little bit about last night. Jews today typically accept that the Bible is their canon, and many Jews also accept that rabbinic literature is their canon. Do those canons have the same status or standing? I'd say it kind of depends on your denomination, and it depends on your perspective. There are some people for whom every word that's found in the Talmud, everything that was uttered by one of the rabbis, is as bedrock as anything found in the Torah. As I was saying last night, that's not true for Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism has for 180 years or so moved away from that model, and at least removed the Talmud from the same canonical standing as the Bible. Which isn't to say it isn't valuable or spiritually meaningful. It just doesn't have the same position as the Bible as establishing. So I would say within a Reform Jewish context, and Rabbi Camel can correct me if I'm totally off base here, but I think in a Reform Jewish context, things in the Bible, specifically the Torah, are bedrock, and everything else is interpretation. So as long as you don't go and reinterpret the Bible, and yet we're always reinterpreting the Torah. We're always, because the Torah was written, if you're a modern person, you recognize that the Torah was written by human beings in a particular time and place with particular ideas. Some of those are not really acceptable to us anymore. So we use interpretation as a way of updating the Bible to fit our standards. And that's something that we've been doing since the rabbinic period, at the very least. Actually, before the rabbinic period, they were doing this. The Book of Jubilees, maybe I'll even mention it later. The Book of Jubilees, which is a document from the Second Temple period that we didn't have a complete version of until they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. The Book of Jubilees is a fantastic example of this. The Book of Jubilees is a retelling of the Bible from Genesis to the giving of the Torah in the middle of Exodus. So why did the author bother to rewrite this book? What was the author's agenda? The author felt that the patriarchs should not be serving tray food to their guests. So Abraham and Sarah, when they have these three visiting dignitaries, are they men? Are they angels? They tell them that Isaac's going to be born. if you look there, they're serving a meat and milk dish. So by the time of the Second Temple period, when the author of the Book of Jubilees was writing their book, that was no longer an acceptable menu. It wasn't kosher. So they rewrite the menu and they rechange it so that it's more in keeping with their understandings of things. So what the rabbis do in terms of like the radical interpretation of the Bible through Midrash has a lot of precedent in much earlier times. And even within the Bible itself, there's a phenomenon called inter-biblical exegesis, where later books of the Bible are interpreting earlier books of the Bible. So, you know, I actually love the fact that there is no bedrock and that we're always interpreting things, because for me, that I find that to be a very meaningful way of thinking about religious life, that human subjectivity is always engaged in the production of new meaning. And I think also in light of recent advances in philosophy and in literary theory, associated with people like Jacques Derrida in literary theory and Hans-Georg Gadamer in philosophy, basically both philosophy and literary theory don't accept the fact that there really are any basic foundational givens of any kind of knowledge. And they would question whether, you know, even on scientific knowledge, which seems to be empirical and provable, they would say, you know, we have to challenge that and recognize that there's always going to be an element of human subjective interpretation involved in the production of those concepts. And so I think that that makes Judaism a religion that was ahead of its time, because it's so built on foundation and reinterpretation. So people ask me sometimes, like, how come I don't see that much hand-wringing in the Jewish community about creationism and like whether evolution is right and dinosaurs and you know, the Earth's been around much longer than 57, 80 years. Why aren't Jews wringing their hands more? And the answer I give is, well, because we've been reinterpreting Genesis 1 for a couple thousand years by now. I mean, we've reinterpreted that text so many times that reinterpreting it in a way that makes it okay with evolution and scientific ways of thinking is not such a challenge. Certain fundamental, even among, you know, really fundamentalist Jews, it's very rare that you have this kind of strict fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. It's becoming more common now. And that's a function of like the influence of evangelical American thinking on Jewish thinking. But for a long time, it wasn't a problem at all. We never had our Galileo moments where we were putting someone on trial for saying that the Earth revolves around the sun. That's not, because Judaism is a fundamentally interpretive thing. So that's something that I find personally meaningful. But I could see if it's something that you're encountering for the first time, might be something challenging. But if it's okay, I'd like to now transition to my scheduled topic. Is that okay? We good?
Yes, please.
Before I transition, I want to apologize. Last night we had this problem about 45 minutes into my lecture that started to be static. This is unfortunately a problem I've encountered with this laptop that I've used before. If it happens again, please let me know and I will leave and come back and it will solve the whole thing. Okay, thank you. So today's lecture is the place of God in Jewish law. And those of you who were present last night already kind of got a preview. Someone asked on the chat last night, or someone asked last night, you know, doesn't Talmud study take away from belief in God? And I answered, yes, it does. In fact, I would say that the rabbinic scholastic move, one of the things that rescued Judaism that the rabbis did was they really emphasized scholasticism. They emphasized like the study of texts, and that's one of the things that Jews have preserved across all denominations and all factions, is an interest in scholarship and text study that has remained relevant. As Jews entered modernity, they struggled with some of their texts. Some of the texts of Judaism were hard for post-Enlightenment rational thinkers to accept. Most famously in this camp, it would be hard to accept all of the mystical writings of Kabbalists who talk about the metaphysics of the world in ways that have much more in common with medieval science than they do with modern science. Medieval philosophers, even going back to ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, when they did their metaphysics and they figured out how did the world get created and how did the planets work and how do human souls work, they kind of armchair quarterbacked it. They basically were sitting at a desk somewhere and they were hypothesizing about how these things work. And if they came up with a compelling system in their head, they then wrote that down. That was their version of the metaphysics. It's very different from what happens with the scientific revolution, where we now start to think about observation, hypothesis, testing. That's what the scientific method is about. It's about proving things from the sources themselves. And so the kind of fantastic speculations of Kabbalah, including things happening in parallel spiritual planes that we cannot see, and all kinds of paradoxical things that defy rational explanation, these became very embarrassing or shameful for modern Jews. So Jews from the Jewish Enlightenment in the 18th century, when they started focusing on their tradition, they basically really suppressed those things. And then when you could look at the Talmud itself, there had been a long-standing traditional division within Talmudic scholarship going back to the Gaonic period, so the period between the 8th and 10th centuries CE, so between about 750 and 1000, right after the completion of the Talmud itself. In that period, in the 8th to 10th century, there began to be a need for the Talmud, which famously, as I mentioned last night, has lots of multiple opinions and unresolved arguments and leaves things very, very open-ended. There began to be a need for there to be a single definitive statement. Jewish law believes this is how you conduct the ritual, or this is a marriage that is considered a marriage, and this is a divorce that's considered a divorce. And so all the debates about those things had to be resolved. And that story, the story of the 8th through 10th centuries, is the story of the institutionalization of Judaism and how a specific group of rabbis and their institutions in Babylonia really took the Talmud and its ideas and they formalized them. Well, one of the things that the Gaonim did, these leaders of these rabbinical academies in Babylonia in modern day Iraq between the 8th and 10th centuries, is they said, we need to be the Supreme Court of Jewish law. We need to have it so that if anyone wants to know what to do, they should come to us. So they encouraged people from around the world, whether they were in Yemen or Egypt or what's now Israel, whether they were in Jordan or even Portugal. If they had a question, they would write a letter to the Gaonic academies in modern day Iraq, in Babylonia. And then the academy would sit and they would study the Talmud and they would digest it and they would produce a response. They would write these responses and send them back via the trade routes by mail. Collectively, they are called responsa. That's the plural form of the word. Individually, they are called a responsum, an individual response. Because the Gaonim were so invested in this business of producing final legal positions, and writing these responsa all over the world, they changed their curriculum so that rather than studying the entire Talmud, they tended to focus on those Talmudic passages that were legal, and not only legal, but still practical in their own day. So they didn't really want to spend too much time talking about sacrifices because they weren't getting a lot of letters about sacrifices. They also weren't spending a lot of time thinking about vows because people weren't making vows anymore. So those kinds of things, they didn't spend a lot of time studying. They instead focused on other things. But each individual, if you remember, those of you who were here yesterday, I described the Talmud as a collage that brings together lots of different types of information, of biblical commentary and legal statements and then stories from people's lives. One of the things that happens is the biblical commentaries sometimes get very extensive. The Talmud will have like a whole page on the Exodus from Egypt. It has nothing to do with legal stuff at all. And then it'll jump from that conversation to another conversation to a long story about a rabbi who went on a voyage to Rome. They'll just go on and then there'll be 2 or 3 pages that will have no legal information at all. And so the more the rabbis in the post-Talmudic period became interested in establishing law, the more they bifurcated their inherited texts, and they said there's two different types in these texts. There's something called halacha, or Jewish law, and there's something called agadah. Agadah is often translated as stories, but really agadah is everything that isn't law. So anything that isn't law. So the way they thought about their texts, and it was just a way of thinking, so that when they opened up their books, if they got to a passage that wasn't legal, they skipped it. To this day, if you go to traditional yeshivas, that's what they do. When they're studying Talmud and they get to a lengthy non-legal passage, they skip it. If maybe they read it in the translation, or they just read it quickly to get the sense of what it is, but they're really not spending any time on it, because what has happened over the course of time is that the Talmud has become in large ways a legal document. And this was also in the post-Enlightenment, this was one of the things Enlightenment figures took advantage of. A lot of the stories that are found in rabbinic literature, whether in Midrash or Talmud, are these fantastic stories about rabbis going on journeys and then being swallowed by dragons. And right, they're these supernatural stories. It's hard to know what to do with them. So the earliest Jewish historians, like Heinrich Gretz, what they did was, when they looked at rabbinic literature and they found the only way they could tell the history of the rabbis was to trust rabbinic storytelling, but they couldn't trust the parts of rabbinic stories that had all these miracles and magical things. So they used their rational brains to basically filter. And they went through the Talmud and they found those stories that had supernatural stuff, and they cut out the supernatural stuff. And they say, well, now it actually is a historical account. So I'll give you an example actually from an earlier period, from a medieval thinker. There's a story that I love in Tractate Megillah, which is about the holiday of Purim. And the text says, on the holiday of Purim, there is a legal obligation for people to drink to the point of inebriation, such that they can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. Right? Haman's the hero, Haman's the villain, Mordechai's the hero, And maybe I've drunk this morning. And they can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. That's what the text says. But what's fascinating about the Talmud is right after you get that text about you have to get drunk, the Talmud tells a story about two rabbis, Rava and Rav Zera. These were fourth generation Babylonian Amoraim. So for those who were listening last night, this might have more value. Fourth generation Babylonian Amoraim. So rabbis who were active around 320 or so CE. And the story is Rav Zera invites Rava over to his house for Purim one year. They get so drunk that Rav Zera beheads his guest, like takes a sword out and he beheads him. And then the text says, in the morning, seeing what he had done, Rav Zera brought his guest back to life. And then the story continues. The next year, Rav Zera invites Rava over again. And Rava says, no, thank you, I'll pass. Miracles don't happen every day. Okay? So it's a story that I love. It's a very funny story. My first book, Narrating the Law, uses that story in the introduction extensively, and to think about the relationship between legal and non-legal texts in the Talmud. But what's interesting about it is this supernatural, like, how do you understand such a story as a historical account? So from an Enlightenment rationalist perspective, you can't understand that someone got decapitated and then came back to life the next morning, even though in rabbinic stories, it's not so uncommon for this kind of thing to happen. So a Talmudic reader reading this, like, okay, this kind of happens. But my son, Abraham, who like his father was a doctor and a philosopher, he wrote a treatise on these stories in the Talmud. And he says, of course it doesn't mean he really decapitated him. What it means is he got a stomach ache, and Rav Zera used a potion, a medical potion, to bring him back to life. And they're just kind of embellishing the story to make it, more exciting that he decapitated him and brought him back to life, right? So here, what I'm demonstrating is, like, already from an early period, there's kind of a rationalist skepticism about these stories. But anyway, post-Enlightenment, a lot of the non-legal material in rabbinic literature really falls by the wayside. 18th century, 19th century Jewish intellectuals, the ones who are going to university and starting to do philology and linguistics, they don't know what to do with the non-legal materials. But the legal materials they really like, because the Talmud's legal materials demonstrate tremendous rational and logical abilities that the rabbis have. I started to mention very briefly last night that one way of thinking about what the rabbis do in their literature For a long time, we used to think that when the rabbis in the Mishnah are talking about, for example, the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court that allegedly existed during the Second Temple period, that the rabbis are actually remembering historically an actual institution that lived. Today's cutting-edge scholarship doesn't accept that. We actually now think there was no Sanhedrin during the Second Temple period. This is all a rabbinic fantasy projecting onto the past their ideal of what life would be like if they had been in charge. Which is really interesting because it allows us to understand the whole project of the Mishnah as a rabbinic attempt to hypothesize or theorize an ideal society. And in that way, when you study rabbinic law, particularly like criminal and civil law, which was never practiced, it's really interesting to look at the rabbinic model and compare it to other models in the world, in various state laws that we have. And so because it's actually a fairly sophisticated system with lots of interesting ways of thinking about legal problems, and legal scholars have been grappling with it for over 1,000 years. So there's the development of the sub-questions. I mean, it's not like in American law, in order for questions of law to be fully developed and vetted, they kind of have to make their way up through the court system. And then finally, the Supreme Court will have a case of first impression, and they will like rule on something, or a lower court will also rule on something. But you actually have to have a situation emerge, and someone has to have standing in the court to bring cases for this to happen. Not so in Jewish law. Jewish law, it's just a bunch of people sitting around in a room theorizing all of the possible cases they can come up with. So doing this for 1,000 years, Jews really developed very nuanced ways of thinking through legal problems. So as Jews entered modernity, as we get particularly into the 20th century, Jewish law starts to be valuable in two places, in Israel and the United States. So in Israel, the 19th century, the late 19th century saw the rise of Zionism as basically the last of the 19th century nationalisms. The 19th century was the age of nationalism. Countries around the world were deciding to think of themselves in national terms. They hadn't thought of themselves that way before. They all started unifying themselves through language, through folk traditions, dance, flags, national anthems, and legal systems. So German nationalism very much was involved in the production of a national German law, which hadn't really existed before. And part of this was, in the nationalist model, you would look back to the Roman law. That was like a very sophisticated imperial system of law. And that was like the model out of which people developed their own national legal systems. So it's not surprising that in the Jewish context, there was an attempt to look to Jewish tradition and produce a Jewish national law. The problem is that Zionism was originally not just irreligious, but it was even anti-religious. Zionism, as I often explain to my students, Zionism begins, one of the major causes of Zionism is the vacuum that's produced in modernity with the collapse of the belief systems of religion. There's this vacuum that's produced, and Jews who used to be traditional or used to find a lot of meaning in traditional practice or used to be very involved in their community are no longer required to be, and they no longer find it meaningful. It doesn't speak to them in light of their Western educations. And that vacuum is filled to a large degree by Zionism. Zionist groups, particularly in Central Europe, Romania, Hungary, also in Russia, in the late 19th century, become places where people kind of join up, and it's where they're affiliated. They're not affiliated with synagogues in the same way. They're affiliated with Zionist identity. Similar things happened in the United States in the late 19th, but really mostly in the early 20th century. If you think about the Lower East Side and political identifications of the Yiddishists and the Bundists and socialists and people like these kinds of political identifications came to take the place of religious identifications in constructing one's identity. Well, so there was an attempt, therefore, to go back and use Jewish law, but to really separate Jewish law from Judaism as a religion. So there were early scholars, and this happened prior to the founding of the state. In the 19-teens and 1920s, you have scholars, Russian scholars, German scholars. These are scholars who are very well trained in Jewish sources. And they start laying the groundwork in the same way that Herzl had produced essentially a parliament in waiting for a state that didn't exist. And there was already a bank in waiting for the state that didn't exist. They started to produce a legal system in waiting for the state that didn't exist. So they start, and their model was to produce a Jewish legal system. The term that's often used is Mishpat Ivri, or Hebrew law. And part of what animated this turn to Hebrew law was the pride in the rigor and depth of Jewish intellectual culture. Jews were very proud of a lot of these figures were people who had roots in Eastern European Talmudic yeshiva tradition and were very proud of the kind of logical sophistication and density of that work. And so they were really putting forward this model of let's go back to our tradition and create a modern legal system. And then the Israeli state was created, the state of Israel was created, and there were members of the founders of the state who were involved in Mishpat Ivri and felt that Mishpat Ivri should have a place at the table, that whatever legal system was going to be put into Israel, if it was going to be a Jewish state, then it had to have Jewish character. And the obvious place to draw Jewish character from was Mishpat Ivri, was this Hebrew law. So actually, since the founding of the state of Israel, there's been a kind of unofficial arrangement where there is always one justice of the Supreme Court who is a specialist in Mishpat Ivri. This has been unchanging since '48. There's always someone on the court who has some basis in Mishpat Ivri. Today in Israeli law schools, Mishpat Ivri, Hebrew law, is a black letter law class. Like everyone has to take at least one course in Mishpat Ivri. It's part of the assumption that, now this is independent. You may know that there are certain areas of Israeli law that are controlled by the religious authority. So the chief rabbinate controls issues of personal identity, things like marriage, divorce, adoption, conversion. And there's a big problem because the rabbinate does not, because the rabbinate is it's ultra-Orthodox, it doesn't acknowledge many American rabbis' conversions and marriages and things like that. It's a big, complicated, it's not just, it's Reform Conservative and Modern Orthodox are all not fully accepted by the chief rabbinate in Israel. Of course, Reform conversions are accepted by the state for purposes of establishing Jewish identity and citizenship, but they're not accepted by the rabbinate. But I'm not talking about the religious matters of law. I'm not talking about the religious authorities and the way they deal with Jewish law. I'm talking about the secular state. When it's dealing with questions of criminal law or civil law, it brings in occasionally Mishpat Ivri, this Hebrew law, which is built on the foundation of Talmudic law, which is built on the Mishnah, which is itself built on biblical materials. And one of the major proponents of this was a scholar and justice named Menachem Elon, who was both a Supreme Court justice and a professor at the Hebrew University, a professor of law. And he wrote the definitive collection, set of works on Mishpat Ivri. It's a 3-volume book entitled in Hebrew, HaMishpat HaIvri, the Hebrew law. It was translated 20 years ago into English. It's a 5-volume introduction to Jewish law. If you're a lawyer and you're interested in this kind of thing, it makes for great reading. In his book, Elon goes out of his way to separate Jewish law as law from Judaism as religion, right? So he works very hard. And he does this using the sources of the Talmud itself. He uses the tradition itself to make an argument that there's a basis within the legal system for separating out the religious from the legal. So there is a distinction that we find all over the place in the Talmud, where the Talmud will make a distinction between certain types of legal requirements that are ritually motivated and certain types that are motivated by civil law or by financial considerations. The Talmud is famous for finding contradictions in earlier rabbinic sources and then trying to explain how those contradictions work together. So one way of answering that is, oh, that was talking about a case of civil law. This is talking about a case of ritual or religious law. And using this model, Elon says we can do the same thing and basically separate out the religious law from the civil and criminal law, and basically say the civil and criminal law that comes from the Talmud and subsequent literature is completely usable in the modern Jewish state without worrying about the religious materials, right? So this is kind of part of where I'm starting, that, you know, there is this field of Mishpat Ivri that is doing this work to separate the religious from the legal. And part of that work of separating the religious from the legal is really taking God out of the legal materials. So the Jewish criminal and civil law becomes all about the Talmudic rabbinic conversation about law, but kind of leaves God out of the picture. I want to switch now to talk about the situation in the United States. So you might not think that Jewish law has any place in the United States. United States law derives from Enlightenment traditions. It comes from British common law, and it evolved through our own country's evolving notions of constitutional theory and, you know, distribution of different branches of government. But there has been interesting work, comparative work, that does Jewish US law comparative work. And it started in the 1960s. It was motivated primarily by, not surprisingly, Jewish law professors who were trying to rethink the law in light of 60s era revolutions in liberalizing society. And in critiquing law, there was an attempt to get outside of the US model and think whether there were other models that might be useful in critiquing the way this country does law. And there were a number of articles that started to appear in various law reviews that started to speak about the certain advantages that Jewish law has over United States law. The advantages of the connection between law and community, the connection between law and mythology in the Bible, mythology in rabbinic literature, acknowledging that the open-ended nature of Talmudic presentation, the multiple opinions that are canonized as truths in the Mishnah, the dialogical model of different generations of scholars speaking to each other and interpreting each other's words, all of these things began to come forth in articles in American law reviews, extolling the virtues of US law as a comparison with, of Jewish law as a comparison with US law. And this culminated in an article that came out in 1983 by a scholar named Robert Cover called Nomos and Narrative. It's an amazing article. If any of you are lawyers out there, even if you're not lawyers, it's a beautiful article that he wrote in the Harvard Law Review, which was then, at least might even still be today, the premier law review in the country. And he was frustrated about a Supreme Court case that some of you may remember. It was the Bob Jones case, where Bob Jones had rules on the books that prevented interracial dating. And the Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of tax code stuff. And so the Supreme Court did sort of strike it down, but it struck it down on a technicality, basically removed the tax standing from Bob Jones, and it didn't really address the heart of the issue. And so Cover basically writes a piece about the thing about law is that law has a relationship with both community and with the community's sense of itself and the sense of history. And what was going on with the Bob Jones case was that you were getting a clash between sub-communities. And the question was, how would a legal system manage a situation in which one sub-community's sense of self, which was tied into its cultural stories about itself as well as its laws, were butting against another sub-communities. And he was making the argument that Jewish law does a better job of handling this kind of pluralistic. Now, again, some of what Cover said is a little bit pie in the sky, but since Cover's work, and again, this was in 83 or 84, since then, a lot of the work that has been done in American legal scholars have used Jewish jurisprudence, and they've focused on it as like a corrective contrast case for United States law, but they focus primarily on the mechanics of how Jewish law works, like how bills become a law or how courts change the meaning within the fantasy model of rabbinic legal interpretation. But what they don't do is they don't really talk about the relationship between the legal materials and the religious. And they don't talk about the relationship between law and theology. And like they certainly don't talk about what role God has in the legal system. And so that's kind of like the foundation of where I'm starting today. And I want to basically today show you ways in which I think, while it's been very productive in both the US and Israeli contexts for people to make this move, I don't think it's really true to the original sources to separate out the religious from the legal and to remove God from the picture, even though there's much basis for it in the sources themselves. As we'll see, there is basis for it. At the same time, it's almost as if the religious doesn't want to be eliminated from the legal. Within the Jewish legal system, even though over the course of time, there have been many cases. I mentioned the Gaonim taking out the non-legal and pushing that away. And there's been a lot of movements that have kind of, we talked yesterday about Maimonides and his code, like he also got rid of the non-legal materials. But as much as these non-legal materials, including theology and God, are like pushed to the side, they still come back in. It is not as easily separated as people would like to say. Okay, so I'll say also, typically when people think about Judaism, they do comparative religious work. What you'll often hear is that Judaism and Islam are religions of law. Christianity is a religion of faith. And there is a lot of truth to that because of the way, particularly Protestantism, prioritizes faith over other things. And Islam and Judaism, it is also fair, both have a really well-developed set of legal norms that govern how you're supposed to be conducting yourself. Or at least originally had such norms. To go back to the original sources, think about what the Bible, where Judaism comes from. Here again, to go back to, someone asks about bedrock, right? There's lots of different foundational aspects of Judaism. If you go back to the Bible, you can find 5 or 6 different things that become foundational for things that happen subsequently. One of these is the notion of a covenant. God makes a covenant first with the patriarchs, and then with the nation at Sinai. God makes a covenant with all of Israel. What is a covenant? A covenant is a contract. And actually, scholars have demonstrated that the covenant of revelation at Sinai is modeled on the Hittite suzerainty agreements. Archaeologists have dug up ancient Near Eastern Hittite suzerainty agreements, which are agreements between a ruler and the subjects that are articulated as a contract. You do X and I will do Y for you. This is what covenantal theology means. Covenant means that God wants human beings to do things. If they do them, if they do what God wants, that is good. If they don't do what God wants, that is bad. Originally, God is the source of law. We do things because they are mitzvot. The word mitzvot is a verbal noun coming from the verb in Hebrew meaning command, right? It is a commandment from your commander to do this. It is a mitzvah. So God is foundational in terms of why we do any of the mitzvot originally. So what happens to change this? How does this change over the course of time? How is it that today the word mitzvah is not as associated with God as it once was? And the word mitzvah, you get to Mordechai Kaplan, the author of Judaism as a Civilization, who produced a new version of Judaism for modern times based on the sociological work of Emil Durkheim, which said, like, we don't really need God. It's really all about community. And why do we do commandments? We do commandments because we're responsible for one another, right? this is another way in which you kind of eliminate God as the basis or foundation for religious and ritual behavior, even though historically it was originally thought that God was the basis for that. If you take a Durkheimian lens and you say, well, religion really isn't about God and the relationship with God, it's about community and human beings, then even though the word mitzvot may come etymologically from a commandment, nowadays it's not really drawing its meaning from that. It's drawing its meaning from responsibility from one another. And actually, one of Robert Cover's amazing articles that he wrote also in the 80s was an article called Mitzvot, a Jurisprudence of Obligation, where he says, the amazing thing about Jewish law is that it's not a legal system based on rights. It's a legal system based on obligation. It's not about what I am entitled to. It's about what I owe you, right? So you can see why this from a progressive perspective would be a fantastic way of using Jewish law as a model of changing ways we think about law in general. Now, so there were two major historical changes that happened to change from the covenant to the kind of interpretive model that we later see with the rabbis. So one thing that happened is, you may have noticed if you were reading your Bible carefully, that at the beginning of the Bible, people can talk to God, right? You just have a relationship with God. Adam and Eve in the garden have a relationship with God. Noah talks to God. Abraham talks to God. Like, people have a relationship with God. And then as you read further in the Bible, it becomes less common. People start having dreams, and then you have Moses has a relationship with God, and the people of Israel hear God on the mountain, but they're not, right? So one thing that happens in the Bible is that the direct relationship with God becomes replaced. It becomes mediated first through prophecy, and then when prophecy ends with the destruction of the first temple, it becomes mediated further through the production of literature. Second Temple period, they produce a lot of literature, and then literature leads to the rise of interpretation, beginning to get static. Thank you. I'm going to come
yes,
right
yeah, I
back.
was about to say that if you wanted to. I think you already did it. Oh, great, wonderful. He was quick on it this time. Also, while we're on it, I don't think I mentioned it actually this morning, but if you have any questions on what he's saying, just write those questions in the chat, and then when we get to the question portion, we will we'll ask him.
Rabbi, I was struck by his comment, and I'm thinking about Kennedy's famous "Ask Not" speech.
Yeah, that's true. That's not what your country could do for you, but you could do for your country. Yes. All right, but I'll turn it over back to you, Dr. Wimpheimer.
Okay, thank you. I accidentally joined Jack Birnbaum's bar mitzvah, but it wasn't ready yet. So I clicked the wrong Zoom link, but I'm back. So one of the things that happens is that the relationship with God gets less and less direct and becomes more and more mediated, so that by the time you get to the rabbis, the relationship is not directly with God at all. There's no prophet who claims to have direct communication with God. There is a set of texts that claim to be written by people who had direct relationship with God, and now we interpret those texts, and that's the way we gain access. But that's a major transition. In addition to that transformation, the other thing that happens is the destruction of the Second Temple, which has major ramifications for transformations in Judaism. And now I'm going to start sharing my screen so I can show you some text with you. So the rabbis are themselves aware of the major ramifications of the transformation, of the change of the destruction of the temple. There is a famous episode, and I'm not going to have enough time to read all of these texts right now, but I'll kind of summarize them and make reference to the bold. And if you're a quick reader, you can read along. The first text is a famous text that many of you may have heard of already. It's the text of an incident that happens as Jerusalem is being destroyed by the Roman army in the year 70 CE. There's infighting within the walls of Jerusalem, and they can't agree on whether to end the siege. And one of the leaders inside Jerusalem is a rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who we actually know to have been a historical figure and to have lived during the temple period, but this story is not historically true. We know this from a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Josephus tells the same story about himself. So Josephus is a much more reliable storyteller than the later rabbis who are writing this 500 years after it happened. But anyway, in the story, Yochanan ben Zakkai convinces his students to smuggle him outside the walls of Jerusalem in a coffin, to pretend that he's dead so that he can try to make peace or an arrangement with the Roman rulers. So somehow they smuggle him outside of Jerusalem, and he gets to meet with Vespasian, who is the general tasked with conquering Jerusalem. And Yochanan ben Zakkai famously predicts to Vespasian that he actually calls him by the title Caesar. And Vespasian says, "You can't call me that." And Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "I can, because I know that you're going to be the Caesar." And as they're sitting there, a messenger arrives and says, "Nero has been assassinated, and now we want you to be emperor." And Vespasian says, "How did you know?" And Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "I am an astute reader of the Bible, and I can do Midrash better than anyone. And the Midrash predicts for me that you are going to be the Caesar." And because of this incident, Vespasian says, "Okay, I'm turning over the theater to my son to destroy Jerusalem." Titus destroys Jerusalem, but I'll grant you the proverbial genie's 3 wishes. Right? So he turns to Yochanan ben Zakkai, and Yochanan ben Zakkai famously says, "Give me Yavne and its wise men." He asks for a few other things, but what this story is, this is a foundation myth of Rabbinic Judaism. It is the moment in which the rabbis acknowledge that Rabbinic Judaism is built on the embers of the destroyed temple, but they make the rabbis the kind of historical agents for this happening. It's not like the rabbis are just kind of sitting back passively and absorbing the blows of history. They're an active participant, and they tell the Roman Empire, "We are going to replace the temple with the rabbinic period." Of course, the Talmud, being an interpretive dialogical text, has a later rabbi asking on this story, "You mean you had 3 wishes and you didn't ask for the temple? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, why didn't you?" And they have to just sort of explain and justify why he didn't ask for the temple. But what's really going on in the story is this is a foundation myth of Rabbinic Judaism. And as part of Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis, in making themselves the agents of history, they needed to trade. They needed to make a trade. They were trading the priests and the prophets for the rabbis. Elsewhere in rabbinic literature, we have the rabbis very actively saying, there used to be priests, now there are rabbis. There used to be prophets, now there are rabbis. There used to be priority for the priests in the market, now there's priority for the rabbis. You'll notice that their choice has worked over the course of time. Rabbis have stood the test of time as the leadership of the Jewish community. So there was something there that they were privy to. The next text really also demonstrates the way that the rabbis confine God. Rabbi Chia bar Ami said, in the name of Ula, "Since the day that the temple was destroyed, the Holy One, blessed be he, has nothing in his world but the 4 cubits of halacha alone." Right? So the temple was God's physical space in the world. One of the big problems with the destruction of the temple is that by the time of the second temple's destruction, this was not true of the first temple's destruction, but by the time of the second temple's destruction, all Jews accepted the fact that there was really only one place to offer sacrifices, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. And they also accepted that the temple in Jerusalem was a unique space of God. It was God's place physically in this world. And that was now gone. So look what this rabbi does. This is a 2nd-generation Babylonian rabbi, Ula, being quoted by one of his students. "Since the day the temple was destroyed, the Holy One, blessed be he, has nothing in his world but the 4 cubits of halacha alone." In other words, what is God's space? God's space is the virtual space of Jewish law. But notice how confined that virtual space is. It is 4 cubits. Now, there is elsewhere in rabbinic law, the rabbis understand there are ways in which one can acquire objects through proximity. If you throw something and it lands at my feet, then I can acquire it. I have a 4 cubit radius around my body, right? They're basically saying, you want to know where God's space is? God's space is that narrow space of halacha defined by the 4 cubits around one's body, right? God doesn't have that kind of large space of the temple anymore. And it's really a weird way of sort of putting God in a box, saying halacha is God's, it's almost like Pandora's box, like God is in this space. Now notice also the language has changed. They're not using the language of mitzvah, of commandment. They're using the language of halacha. Halacha becomes the dominant language of Jewish law, and that's because halacha comes from the word lalechet, or to go. And the best etymological explanation for why is because halacha aims to describe how people live, right? So it's again that kind of Durkheimian move. It's not about the mitzvah. It's not about the commandment and the commander-commandee relationship. It's about the rituals that we conduct or the life choices that we make in our lives. It's the way we walk. It is our walking, right? So even that etymological shift from mitzvah to halacha says a lot about you're changing the space of God and the role of God as authority. Law is now not so much about authority and commander, but about practice, about ritual and performance. Now, the next text is a fantastic text that I use to illustrate one of the ways the rabbis were incredibly revolutionary in the Talmud. It's a text that I call Moses the Time Traveler, or Time Traveling Moses. It's a story about how Moses goes up to heaven and he sees God writing the Torah. Because in rabbinic understanding, it wasn't just the 10 commandments that came down with Moses from Sinai, it's the entire Torah, which doesn't make sense because Moses supposedly wrote the Torah and the last 7 verses of the Torah describe Moses' own death. The rabbis have a whole Talmudic conversation about how this can work. Joshua wrote those 7 verses. Moses wrote them prophetically. There's all kinds of explanations. But in rabbinic thinking, Moses gets from God the entire Torah. Again, historically not accurate. But in this story, Moses goes up to heaven and sees God doing the scribal work of writing the Torah scroll. If you've ever looked at a Torah scroll, you know that there are a number of letters. Sha'atnez Getz is the acrostic. Shin Ayin Tet Nun Zayin Gimel and Tzadi. Those letters have crowns in the Torah scroll. If you ever look at the letters, they have special decorative calligraphic crowns. So Moses goes up to heaven and sees God attaching crowns to the Torah and says, "Why are you doing this?" And God says, there will one day be a man many years from now who will have the ability to interpret those crowns and derive new meanings in the text from those crowns. And Moses says, there is such a person and you're giving the Torah to me? Well, why not give the Torah to him? So God says, oh, I'll show you. And so God takes Moses on a journey, and Moses gets transported magically to Akiva's study hall in the early rabbinic period. And he sits in the back row of Akiva's study hall, and he hears Akiva's creative interpretation of the Torah, and he cannot follow. Because this man who is the ultimate giver of the Torah, we say the Torah comes from Moses at Sinai, he can't follow what Rabbi Akiva is saying because it's not in the Torah. And then at the end, the disciples say to the master, how do you know this? And Rabbi Akiva says, it is a law given to Moses at Sinai, and that language comforts Moses. So when Akiva says, I know this because Moses told me, Moses, who doesn't understand the lecture, is very comforted by this, right? So, I mean, the story has a really bizarre, terrible ending, which I'm not going to get into now. But what I get out of this story is the rabbis were remarkably able to have a kind of cognitive dissonance within their religious experience. They were very aware that the kinds of creative meanings they were producing out of the text were not the original meanings of the text, but they used theology to authorize these new meanings. They basically had a way of, they knew historically that these were not Moses's meanings, but they said theologically they are Moses' meanings. Moses authorizes us to do this. Moses is okay with us doing this. And that brings us to the famous Oven of Achnai story as well. So the Oven of Achnai story, which I referenced last night, is a similar story because the rabbis are having a debate in their study hall. One rabbi says a certain oven can become impure. Sorry, cannot become impure. Rabbi Eliezer says that oven cannot become impure. When he declares it clean, what he basically means is the way rabbinic impurity law works is trees can't become unclean. Furniture can become unclean. What about lumber, right? Can lumber become unclean? So that's when the rabbis start doing their work. Is lumber closer to a tree, or is it closer to a piece of furniture? And then we might open this up and have a debate, and people will say, well, it depends. Like, is it treated lumber? Has it been sanded? Is it on the truck ready to, right? I mean, it might depend in the process. And this is what the Talmud often does with lots of areas of law. So a certain oven that actually uses stones. And so Rabbi Eliezer says it's too much, it's more stone than manufactured oven. So it can't become impure. It's clean. And the sages say, no, it's more manufactured oven than stone. So it becomes unclean. And the story is, this is the oven of Achnai. And what happens? Rabbi Eliezer brings forth proofs. He wants to prove to everyone that he's right. If the halacha agrees with me, if Jewish law agrees with me, let this carob tree prove it. Thereupon the carob tree was torn 100 cubits out of its place. Others say 400 cubits. The others say no proof can be brought from a carob tree. So he goes back to work. If the halacha is like me, let the stream of water prove it. Whereupon the stream of water flows backward. And they say, sorry, no proof from a stream of water. We're not buying it. Supernatural proofs are not going to do it for us. Rabbi Josh, so he says, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove. And so the walls of the schoolhouse start to fall. And the other rabbi on the opposing team says, no, walls of the schoolhouse. You're not allowed to decide. It's not your business. Mix out, as you would say in Yiddish, right? So, and when scholars are engaged in a halachic dispute, what have you to interfere? And the text tells us that to this very day, the walls didn't fall, but they also didn't go upright. They're kind of leaning because they didn't know which way to go. They were torn by this rabbinic dispute. And finally, Rabbi Eliezer says, if the law is like me, let it be proved from heaven. In other words, let God. Whereupon a heavenly voice cried out, why do you dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, seeing that in all matters the halacha agrees with him? So he asks God for final, who's right? And God says Rabbi Eliezer is right. And here I have the bolded part. But Rabbi Joshua arose and exclaimed, it is not in heaven. What did he mean by this? Said Rabbi Jeremiah, the Torah had already been given at Mount Sinai. We pay no attention to a heavenly voice, because thou hast long since written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority must one incline. Right, so this is a very provocative text in which the rabbinic storyteller is saying that God has a position on what the law is, and the rabbis say, we don't care. But notice that the storyteller who came up with this story felt a little weird or guilty about this story. There's a little bit of anxiety about usurping God's place. And so there's a kind of coda that comes. Rabbi Nathan met Elijah and asked him, so Elijah, who goes between heaven and earth, Rabbi Nathan, one of the rabbis, meets him and says, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, which is a euphemism for God, what did God do? In other words, what did God react? And Elijah says, he laughed with joy. He replied saying, my sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me. By the way, that with joy is added by the Sonsino translator. It's not in the original text. And it's an interpretive mood by the translator to soften the blow of the text, because it's really not clear if God is happy with my children have defeated me or not. But in the most radical way of reading this text, you can eliminate God from Jewish law because my children have defeated me. And in some ways, the text is saying that God approves of this. So the people like Menachem Elon or Mordechai Kaplan or Robert Cover, or whoever is actually eliminating God from Jewish law has a significant basis, because there is within rabbinic literature itself a move away from understanding law as foundational, based on biblical law, based on the commandments of God that we saw earlier. But here's where I have to add some corrections. And here's where I have to push back a little bit and show you that actually, as much as they are trying to get rid of God, there are a number of ways in which God is not fully eliminated from Jewish law, even in the criminal and civil law that Menachem Elon talks about and touts in Mishpat Ivri. So First of all, one thing to point out is that as opposed to Mishpat Ivri, which separates the criminal and civil from the rest of the laws, Judaism in general does not separate its laws into those categories. If you look in Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law produced in the 16th century, it has 4 sections. In each of those sections, it deals with different parts of Jewish law, but it has a section on purities. It has a section on rituals, on how you conduct prayers and things like that. Those aspects of ritual performance, many of which are oriented towards God. If you think about prayer being oriented towards God, since much of the law is about those rituals, it's really hard to fully remove God. The only way that someone like Menachem Elon can do this is by claiming to separate out the criminal and civil from the religious. But in the Talmud and in the rest of the history of Jewish law, that has not been separated out. That is one piece. So that's the first thing. The other thing I'll point out is one of the things we see happening in rabbinic literature a lot, and my colleague and friend Chaya Halberstam has a book that talks about this extensively. I'm blanking on the name of this book, published about 10 years ago with Indiana University Press. God functions as a kind of alternative legal system for the rabbis. So throughout rabbinic literature, as you're reading, while the rabbis are comfortable imagining a legal system in which they would have control of corporal punishment or capital punishment, they often rely on the fact that there is a backup legal system administered out of heaven by God and God's court. So there are areas of law where the rabbis don't feel comfortable saying that the decision should be the death penalty, but they say, leave it up to God. God will decide. And actually, this alternative legal system finds expression in a kind of bizarre way in this text that I'm providing. It's a little known text, and it actually makes God even more than an alternative legal system. God is kind of the guarantor of the rabbinic legal system. God is the thing that makes rabbinic legal system active, even though the rabbinic legal system is something of a fantasy, because you can imagine that God is kind of the police force that is implementing Jewish law to this day, right? So here's the text. So too it was taught in the school of Hezekiah. So this is a Tannaitic school from the 2nd century. From the day the temple was destroyed, although the Sanhedrin, so the fantasy Supreme Court of the Second Temple period, although the Sanhedrin was abolished, the 4 modes of execution, which the rabbis talk about as having existed in this fantasy body, were not abolished. 4 modes of execution. They were not abolished, you say? But surely they were, right? We don't do capital punishment anymore. We don't see that in the rabbinic period. So they say, but the law of the 4 modes of execution was not abolished. He who is worthy of stoning either falls from the roof or is trampled to death by a wild beast. He who merits burning either falls into the fire or is bitten by a serpent. He who is worthy of decapitation is either delivered to the Gentile government or brigands attack him. He who is worthy of strangulation is either drowned in a river or dies of suffocation. Right? Now, again, I don't want to get into the historical accuracy of this case, of this statement, or whether it's true or not true. What I'm simply pointing out is, from the perspective of the early rabbis, God plays an important role as kind of this backup system. We can't implement Jewish law right now, but if we believe in God, we can believe that God implements the logic and the punishments that we find in Jewish law. In addition to that, we also have other places in the Jewish legal system where God shows up. So there's all of this stuff. There's a whole tractate about oaths, and there's a tractate about vows. In both oaths and vows, the way those things work is you make a pledge and you say, I'm going to do this, and God, so help me God, basically, like we say in court when we testify. And in the rabbinic thinking, God is the guarantor of your statement. And the rabbis even expand the notion of oaths and vows, and they bring it into their own legal system, even in like hypothetical situations that someone like Elon would be importing into Mishpat Ivri. So I have this example for you from Mishnah Baba Metzia 4:2. So if person A drew into his possession person B's produce without paying him the money, right? So this is a transaction. the Mishnah, being a legal text, is interested in how the mechanics of transactions work. And it believes that the physical transaction is really the most important thing. When one person takes physical possession of another person's item, then the deal is struck. You may be familiar with Jewish practices in like the Diamond District in New York, where they have like special formula. They say Mazel Ubracha. There's the language that they say to execute their business deals, and they have handshake agreements. But according to formal rabbinic law, the actual transfer of the physical object is what finishes the transaction. If A drew into his possession B's produce without paying the money, even though he hasn't paid yet, he cannot retract. The deal is struck. You owe the money at that point. If he paid him the money, but did not draw into his possession his produce, he can withdraw, right? So if you're in two-way transaction where someone's changing money for goods, the person who has the goods, if you take the goods in your hand, you can't go back. If you take the money, you are allowed to go back because it doesn't execute the transaction. But the rabbi said, he who punished the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersion, right, the Babylonian exile, sorry, not the Babylonian exile, the generation of the flood and the generation of the Babylonian, the Tower of Babel, he will take vengeance of him who does not stand by his word. Right? So there are occasional statements in the rabbinic civil law where the rabbis say, legally you're right, you can go back on this arrangement, but God's going to get you, right? So there are areas in which even in the civil and criminal law, it's very hard to separate out God from these things. And basically what people like Elon do is they try to ignore these things when they show up and say that they're not really fundamental to the legal system. I like to think, and I'll stop my share now. I like to think of God and Jewish law in a kind of Freudian sense as, I think this is also helpful for thinking of God and Judaism in the post-rabbinic world. I think of God as an absent presence. So Freud famously developed various theories of Oedipal development, and these have been disproven or replaced or whatever. But he also applied many of these principles, his Oedipal thinking he applied also to religion, to thinking about in his book, Moses and Monotheism. He said that Moses is basically the religious father of the Jews, and the Israelites in the desert kill Moses, and in Moses's place, they, to cover up the shame of their primal murder, they replace Moses with the laws that they put in Moses's name. It's what the later Freudian psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan refers to regularly as the name of the Father. Freud says that our conscience, the thing that tells us whether we're doing good or not, that's really the internalized absent father. Basically, in childhood, our father's the one telling us no, and we internalize that voice, and that becomes how we have a sense of morality in the world. Of course, feminists and other theorists have critiqued Freud's misogyny and male-oriented psychology, but the metaphor of how he applies it to Judaism is actually, I think, a very helpful way of thinking what happens with the rabbis and the way the rabbis kind of replace God with a highly developed legal system. And so when people in Mishpat Ivri or American legal scholars or Mordechai Kaplan, when they go the full distance and they completely suppress God, I think they're just actually picking up on potential that's there within the rabbinic sources themselves. But Freud would also recognize the metaphor of the return of the repressed, that as much as you want to sort of tamp down that voice of the Father occasionally to do other things, it often kind of bubbles to the surface. So that's, I think, what happens with rabbinic law and post-rabbinic law and Jewish law today. As much as people might want to make Jewish law independent of God, God hovers over or under Jewish law as kind of a present absence or an absent presence, and occasionally makes an appearance that reminds people of the centrality of God to Jewish law, at least foundationally, even if people choose not to put God centrally there in the present. I'll stop there and take some questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I see we have a couple questions in the chat. First,
Yes.
coming from Jan. Does the story about the oven, specifically "My sons have defeated me," have a relationship to the distinction between process and substantive outcomes? Or in other words, is the issue really God separating out from the legal process because this has been given to the people? The responsibility resting with people is more important than any single outcome.
So the Oven of Achnai has become such a popular text, and there have been so many different readings of this text. You can absolutely read the text that way. So that means, as I'm understanding the question, as I'm understanding your question, you can understand God to be saying, even though I have a view, I don't want that view to be dispositive. I don't want that view to be decisive, because it's more important to me that the people be the ones to determine this. And I think this is a theology. This kind of view is very much in keeping with contemporary theologians like Abraham Joshua Heschel, in God in Search of Man, where contemporary theologians like to think about, they kind of go back and forth in recognizing that we produce ideas of God, and then those ideas of God, or the character of God that we produce, then gives us authority or power to have control over our religious lives. And that's a kind of the way I read this text. So I think I read it a little bit more. I think you can read it as just a question of process versus substance, but I was choosing to read it more maximally here, that it's even more than that. That God is basically saying, I'm out of the picture, but that's also okay. Like, I don't have to be central to the picture anymore. Which one of the advantages of this. One of the advantages of this way of thinking about law is there tends to be a confusion. People often, particularly within legal systems, people tend to confuse a final legal decision with a notion of truth. And particularly within a religious setting in which you believe that God is the source of truth, or the source of meaning, to then have that God say, this is what the final legal decision is, you would think that would be understood to be truth, but the rabbis are telling you that a legal position and truth aren't necessarily the same thing. So lots of theologians, from David Hartman to Irving Greenberg and Elie Wiesel, have written extensively about this. Rachel Adler in Engendering Judaism writes about this passage. There's been a lot of work on the Oven of Achnai passage. Someone should really do a book where they collect like all of the different interpretations. My colleague Jeffrey Rubenstein has a number of books. My colleague at NYU has a number of books on rabbinic stories. And in his first one, called Talmudic Stories, he has a chapter on the Oven of Achnai where he kind of collects all of the academic thinking on this passage. But there's been a lot of work by theologians and legal scholars also. So someone really needs to go and collect all of that. And I guess this relates to Cynthia's question, is God beyond the law or subject to it? Right, this is a great question, particularly for our age. I mean, we live in an age where the question of whether our monarch is subject to the law is unfortunately an active question that we seem to be struggling with for the first time in a couple of centuries. What's interesting is if you look at comparative ancient Near Eastern law, so one of the things that distinguishes biblical law from comparative ancient Near Eastern law was that in comparative ancient Near Eastern law, the law was the product of the king. The king was inspired by gods, like Hammurabi's code opens with this prologue. The king was inspired by gods, and then the king, inspired by gods, produces the law, but the law is the king's. And this means that, like, the king has license to basically ignore the law or ignore the specific outcomes of the law. Unfortunately, we've seen the way that a president can commute a sentence in recent days, and it's kind of like a holdover from when monarchs had power over the law. But actually, in biblical law, it's very clear that the Bible's model is that there is no human being who is above the law. The law does not belong to Moses, and it doesn't belong to a king. It belongs to God, which is why later in the Bible, you can have a prophet tell King David, you have done something wrong, because King David is subject to the law. Or a later prophet tells King Ahab, you have violated the law. The king is not allowed. Ahab uses eminent domain to basically steal property from an underling. And a prophet comes and tells him, you're not allowed to do this. So biblically, God is above the law. The law is God. So God kind of has the position of the ancient Babylonian monarch in terms of the law being God's. So is God subject to the law? So actually, you can find passages in the Bible that want to make God subject to the law. And that's also in the same way that I told you about that passage about God finding space within the 4 cubits of halakha. One way of reading that text is basically saying God is subject to the halakha, that God is, and we find this in rabbinic thinking, you know, when the rabbis go back and they reread the encounter between God and Abraham over the destruction of Sodom. And God says, you know, how can I destroy Sodom without consulting with Abraham? There were later rabbinic interpreters that said, well, the reason why God had to do this was that God is subject to the law. God has to establish the legal or ethical bona fides for this massacre according to the rubrics of later. Of course, historically, it's an anachronism, but ideologically, there were various legal thinkers who said God should be subject to the law. And it is something that we find, you can find, you know, Yiddish writers who imagined God being put on trial. And then in post-Holocaust theology, this becomes a major thing. Elie Wiesel wrote a book called God on Trial, which is all about, you know, the ramifications of the Holocaust on Judaism. And one of the ramifications is, if you were going to think of Judaism as being a legal, ethical culture, then you have to put God on trial too, right? So this is something that has developed in the modern period very explicitly, but I think the roots of it are in rabbinic thinking as well. That passage of Ula saying that God is subject to the halakha. Someone asked, with regard to vows, doesn't Numbers 30 speak to this? So I think Numbers 30, if I'm remembering my Bible, Numbers 30 is the passage in the Bible that talks about when a woman makes a vow, her husband has the right to nullify that vow. Is that correct, Jay and Carol, who asked the question? Yes? Yes. So the Bible in Numbers 30 talks about vows. Elsewhere in the Bible, earlier in the book of Numbers, the Bible talks about vows, and it also talks about making a vow to be a Nazirite, to sort of not cut your hair, and to be someone like the biblical Samson, who devotes himself to God, a kind of monastic pledge. Samson is not celibate, famously, but the monastic pledge of someone like the prophet Samuel. Right, so there are a number of places in the Bible, and there's also famously the episode in the book of Judges where the judge Jephthah makes a vow that if God allows him to succeed in battle, he will offer as sacrifice the first thing that exits his house. And then his daughter is the first thing that exits his house. He thought it was going to be a sheep, but it's his daughter is the first thing that exits his house. And then it seems from the book of Judges that he sacrifices his daughter in fulfillment of this vow. It's kind of similar to the Iphigenia story in ancient Greek myth, and has parallels, of course, to the biblical Akedah story of the binding of Isaac, though in the Akedah story, famously, Abraham does not sacrifice Isaac, substitutes a ram for Isaac, though there were, of course, midrashic traditions that have Abraham actually go through with the sacrifice of Isaac. And like that story I told earlier, then Isaac is somehow brought back to life. Ways of making that work, that Isaac really was a sacrifice who's brought back to life. That's actually in Islam, of course, Ishmael is the subject of the Akedah rather than Isaac. And there are strong Islamic traditions where Ishmael is actually sacrificed, that also has ramifications for later Islam. What is the mutual influence between the Siddur and the Talmud? Great question. It appears that the theology of our prayers differs from that of the Talmud. Okay, so yes, and yes. The Siddur, I mean, I don't know which Siddur you guys use. I assume one of the Reform Siddurim?
Yeah, we use the Mishkan Tefillah.
Mishkan Tefillah, right? So the Siddur Mishkan Tefillah is, of course, heavily modified by the Reform movement to make it ecumenical. So to take out the texts that talk about Jewish exceptionalism or Jewish chosenness. It is also modified to reduce or diminish the number of texts that advocate for a practical return to the land of Israel, and in some kind of practical political way. The theological notion of returning to Jerusalem remains in the prayer book, but in addition to those changes, if you just think about the prayer book, the Siddur in general, used across the denominations before the modern edits. So the Siddur, when the rabbis were around during the rabbinic period, there was no Siddur. There was no set of fixed prayers. I mean, maybe there were some prayers that everyone said, like the Shema prayer, but there weren't. And then the rabbis produced the Amidah prayer that the rabbis produced, but the Amidah of the rabbis included a text that's probably not in Mishkan Tefillah, the text of Velam al-Shinim, the Birkat HaMinim it's called. It's the blessing of the heretics. If it's in your Mishkan Tefillah, then it would be significantly modified. It was originally kind of an anti-Christian polemical prayer, and over the years it developed different pieces of it that also became fairly explicitly anti-Christian. And the various movements in modern Siddurim have modified this. But one of the things that's fascinating about the Siddur is that the liturgy tended to be kind of like a grab bag of Jewish religious practices and beliefs over time. And in the post-Talmudic world, Jews went in different ways. Different parts of the Jewish world went in different ways. So you had, in Spain and North Africa, for example, a very strong Aristotelian and Neoplatonic philosophy. Maimonides, very strongly philosophical. He comes up with a very deistic theology. Maimonides basically doesn't believe in the God of the Hebrew Bible. His notion of God is that God created the world and then kind of went away, and the world kind of runs by itself. God does not have an ongoing relationship with people. God set the world in motion, as Aristotle said, was the unmoved mover. And then since then, basically has not really had an ongoing relationship with people in the world. Maimonides famously wrote his 13 Principles, and the 13 Principles end up in the Siddur as Adon Olam, right? Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra, that prayer, that poem, that's Maimonides. That's deistic theology. Then you have in Provence, in the southern region of Spain and France and the northern region of Spain, they developed Kabbalah. And the Kabbalists got really into this notion of God being multiple. So there was a notion of Aristotle's God, the Ein Sof, the infinite God, but there were also this notion of the Sfirot, the multiplicity of God, 10 different entities that interact with each other, and the balance of whom is necessary for peace and harmony in the world. And Isaac Luria in the 16th century came up with the concept of Tikkun Olam, which in the Reform movement is all about social justice, but in the 16th century was about creating peace and harmony and balance among these Sfirot, among these divine energies. So if you look in the prayer book, you'll see on Friday night, the Lecha Dodi is all about Lurianic mysticism and balancing the Sfirot and the relationship between heavenly males and heavenly females. And then in some Sidurim, you get the Anim Zmirot, which is a liturgical poem. It's a poem that is it's chock full of Sephirotic mysticism. It's all about the relationship between the 10 aspects of divinity, and it talks about God in physical terms, like talks about God's head and God's hair and God's hands. Maimonides is offended and horrified by the notion that God has a body. How could God have a body? God is not a physical entity. But the Kabbalists embrace the notion that God has a physical body. And the prayer book, you'll go to a synagogue, and in close succession, they'll do Anim Zmirot, which will talk about God's body, and then they'll do Adon Olam, in which you say explicitly God has no body. Or on Friday night, you'll do Lecha Dodi, which is all about the physical sexual relationship between divine energies. And then afterwards, you'll do Adon Olam that says God has no body, right? So the prayer book is a kind of hodgepodge. It's a testament also to the pluralism of Judaism, that we have these things that don't really agree in the liturgy. So I'm not sure what you're noticing about the liturgy and the Talmud, but there's lots of stuff. And I'd say the liturgy tends to be a little bit more traditional. Certainly the High Holiday liturgy really imagines a very active presence of God in our lives. Maimonides would struggle greatly with prayers like Unitana Tokef Kedushat Hayom, the central prayer of the High Holidays of Rosh Hashanah, where God is judging us and deciding who will die, who will live. Maimonides says, no, that doesn't happen. God is not actively deciding that on a regular basis. But our liturgy is a compilation. That particular prayer comes from Northern Europe, which was a very traditional society and still believed in an active present God long after Maimonides came along. So that prayer would be something written by a contemporary of Maimonides in a completely different culture. And our prayer book receives and accepts and absorbs all these different traditions. So I actually find that when occasionally I find a poem like a piyut in the Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur prayer book that has a cross-reference to a Talmudic concept, I'm always blown away that this is the same world. Because sometimes it feels like it's not the same world, but occasionally you will see like a legal concept being used by a poet in a High Holiday poem. And it's like, they were actually studying the Talmud and drawing that as a basis for their liturgy. I noticed we're up against time, but I see one more question. Isn't a covenant different from a contract? A contract can be terminated by either party. A covenant is only terminated by the death of one of the parties. I'm glad you asked that question. You are definitely a better legal scholar than I am for being attentive to that difference. When I teach this, I am usually not so sensitive to the difference between covenant and a contract, but you are certainly right by the terms of English law. But it is actually a question, how does the Jewish one that starts in the Bible work? Contract can be terminated by either party. And again, I will reference post-Holocaust theology, because one of the things that post-Holocaust, the theologians struggled with is, can there continue to be a relationship or a notion of a personal God within Judaism in the aftermath of Auschwitz, in the aftermath of the horrible destruction, which cannot be explained through any kind of up with before to explain why good people suffer, comes to the Holocaust and cannot explain this situation. And various theologians struggle to explain this in different ways. And one of the theological responses that has found the most traction among people in general is Irving Yitz Greenberg's notion that the Holocaust breaks the covenant, right? So it can't, that it's actually, it was a contract or was a covenant, and it doesn't get terminated. And so as long as God and the Jewish people are both alive, this covenant keeps going. And it can't be terminated. But Greenberg says until the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, the covenant has become a contract, and it can be terminated by any person who just doesn't feel like they can abide by this agreement anymore. And he basically says Judaism from post-Holocaust has to be more of a voluntaristic tradition, where you're committing yourself to do things, but this notion of a covenant, of a mutual thing where if I do good, I'll be rewarded. If I do bad, I'll be punished. That is no longer active. That's been broken.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for both answering all the questions and the wonderful lecture that you just had and just gave to us. I think we're all, much more knowledgeable on the role of God in halakha, in law. And I also just want to do a couple other big thank yous to the chairs of our Lifelong Learning Committee and Barb Turner and Mary Jawalski, who is really in charge of this program, but all the Lifelong Learning Committee, who's just been so wonderful, and to everyone for joining us, and of course to Dr. Wimpheimer for coming and really just enlightening us so much. And just one quick plug for those who want to keep on learning about Talmud. Mondays at 7 o'clock, you can come on where we are studying, so it's great. But this was really just absolutely wonderful. I encourage everyone to, if you'd like, to say either thank you out loud or in the chat, however you'd like to do it. But this has really been wonderful.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank
It's a
you.
great lecture.
Very much.
Thank you.
Very
Wonderful,
much.
wonderful.
Thank you.